Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Toth, and pleasure to introduce the panel here. We've got Avik and Jackson Mejia, and this is the Neglected Drivers of Inflation panel. Initially, I thought it was the Distracted Drivers panel, but that's a different panel. So there'll be no texting and talking up here as we kind of go through our panel. Really excited, obviously, very timely topic. We're going to be talking about, essentially what's been playing out economically across the country over the last few years. Where I thought we would start is on how we measure inflation. We're going to start sort of talking about the tools. In order to know what's driving inflation, I think we need to have a conversation about how we're measuring inflation to begin with. So Jackson, why don't I start with you? How are we measuring inflation? You as an economist, do you see that our tools are accurate, they're sophisticated? Are they up to the challenges that we're having?
Yeah, so I guess it's going to start with the basics, which is just that the way that the government measures inflation is they take a fixed basket of goods and they use that to weight different prices that they observe through surveys and that kind of thing. And these baskets are fixed over time, which can cause a problem because during COVID, patterns of consumption changed a lot, which affects measurement quite a bit. But it's also problematic for other reasons because there are declining response rates in surveys, and so it's not super obvious whether we're actually capturing consumption properly or not. There have been changes in measurement over time. So, for example, Larry Summers had a paper a few months ago about the fact that the housing component of inflation the way they measure that has changed substantially. And if you measured it properly and according to the old standard, inflation would have reached something like 18%, I think, last year. And it's very hard for them to do it properly. And so they do their best, but other measures indicate that they could be doing a lot better.
Yeah, I would just add to that amplifying what Jackson was just saying, just to talk about this Larry Summers paper a little bit and some of the things on how we measure inflation. Like, I think people tend to look at inflation and say it's an objective statistic. And it's really important to understand that inflation is not exactly an objective statistic. Like, we tend to, our intuition is that inflation, the way we measure inflation is like the way we measure somebody's weight, right? Like, if inflation is 3%, that's like my weight is 190 pounds. And that's not true. Inflation is a judgment by some very smart people who think about this stuff all the time, but it's a judgment of, okay, what does the average consumer in an urban setting, CPIU, the typical measure of inflation is Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. So it's ignoring rural prices for one thing, but it's the way CPI is measured is the economists say, okay, what does the average consumer buy in a given month, and in what proportions, and how much are those things going up or down? So that requires a lot of judgment. Surveys, polls, et cetera, like, what is the average consumer buying? And as Jackson has shown with a lot of his work, if you're poor or wealthy, what you're actually spending your money on is very different. And so what the basket of goods an average person buys per month, if you're making $20,000 a year, is very different than if you're making $200,000 a year. So not only is the inflation number it's wrong because it impacts poor people versus wealthy people differently. Because if you're poor, you don't have an extra $600 lying around if your rent goes up or your gas prices go up. But it's also because actually what you're spending the money on is different. And so the components, if the things that poor people spend more money on go up disproportionately highly, then inflation is much higher for you on that front. Then there's the fact that, as Jackson was alluding to, the way we measure these things can be inaccurate. So the way in particular we measure the rise in housing prices is through a lot of very quirky measurements, one of which is a survey of homeowners who are asked, if you were to rent out your home, how much rent do you think you could get for it? It's called owner's equivalent rent. But like, I don't rent out my home. How am I supposed to know how much it costs to rent out? I mean, like, now you have Zillow, you can kind of go online and see maybe what your neighbors are renting their houses out for, their apartments. But that kind of begs the question of, why aren't we just using Zillow's data or other like tech enabled things that we have now that are much more accurate than the survey data? The Fed doesn't want to do that, and we could get into why. There's conspiracy theory versions and there are like non-conspiracy theory versions. But the end result is that the official measures of inflation really understated a couple of years ago how much housing prices had increased during COVID. And it was kind of a lagging indicator. So CPI was going to stay high for longer than actual inflation was being experienced by people, because the housing prices that actually jacked up a few years ago, it took a while for that to flow through the system. And then there's the Larry Summers point, which is that Larry Summers and some colleagues wrote this article, which I wrote up for Forbes, where they actually pointed out that. So another thing about CPI is over time, the economists who decide how inflation is measured change their minds about stuff. They change what's in the basket. They change how the calculations are made. So prior to, I believe, 1980, 1983, thank you, the interest rates were factored into inflation in this way. Like, let's say you buy a car, and you buy a car by getting a loan from the bank. The interest rate of that loan affects your monthly car payment, right? If interest rates are low, you're going to have a lower car payment. If they're higher, you have a higher car payment. Same with a mortgage for a home. So prior to 1983, the interest rates you were paying for those things was included in the CPI basket. After 1983, they got rid of it. And the argument at the time was, well, inflation, like if you already own your home, you're experiencing inflation in a different way than if you aren't. If you have a mortgage versus you don't have a mortgage. So how do we put all these things together? But the end result is that in a time when interest rates are going up like they have been over the last several years, that's understating inflation, right? So, and especially with car payments, they make a really compelling argument that almost everybody who buys a car, doesn't pay cash. It's like 85 to 90% of all car purchases are done through loans, and that doesn't even include leases, right? Which are also very sensitive to interest rates. So all that to say that these arguments happen all the time among the people who study this stuff. But if you just read the paper, you would never know. It would never be presented to you that inflation and the measurement of inflation is actually this super complex and subjective thing. And so that's why sometimes when you, in the last year or two, when you'd hear people say, well, why is everyone saying in polls that inflation, they're upset about inflation when inflation is actually decreasing? Well, the big part of the reason why is because the rate of price increases decreasing doesn't mean they have gone down, right? Prices are still high. So that's the obvious thing that a lot of these academics were missing. But another piece of it is that, the headline inflation number may not be the real world experience that a lot of people are facing, especially people in the bottom half of the ladder. And so it's really important to always be aware of that if you're a policymaker, and know that the way people are experiencing inflation may be different than the headline number, and that's not because those people who are talking about their experience are somehow yahoos who don't understand what's really going on in the economy. It's because the things they're consuming are a different basket than what the official estimate is.
Great. And Avik mentioned polls. So I've got to introduce our panelist to my right, Katie Zaboff, who's a state representative from Montana. Thank you for your service in the legislature. And, there's a lot of conversation in Washington, D.C. and New York about inflation. You see the headlines, but then it's being experienced, I think, differently across the country. So what's the experience of your constituents? How have they been feeling about inflation? And what's, is there a disconnect between, the headlines and what's in the news and what you're hearing from your constituents in Montana?
Great question. Thank you for having me here today. So I think, I think everyone is experiencing inflation across the country. That's a given. In Montana, where I'm at, and this isn't unique to us in any way, but our housing market absolutely exploded after COVID. So to give some background on that, this problem goes back, before 2010, but I'm going to use that year for the statistics. So from 2010 to 2020, for every 10 doors that needed to be built just to sustain Montana's population, which for those of you that don't know, it's not very big. We're just over 1 million people. For every 10 doors that needed to be built, only 7 were being built. So already we had a situation where not enough housing was being built for our citizens. And then when you had a big influx of new people moving to Montana, things just absolutely skyrocketed. So my constituents and, the people of Montana, yes, we're facing inflation challenges. You go to the grocery store, things are a lot higher than they used to be. But also for many, many people, they can hardly pay their rent. They can hardly pay their mortgages. So this is a problem that is just, it's devastating. I mean, you can only make so many cuts, right? And how do you can buy beans and rice and live off of that for a week, but what is the equivalent of that for where you live? You can't really save on your rent each month. So that's something that the citizens of Montana have been dealing with and grappling with in the past couple of years.
And Jackson and Avik, I know you've both done some research on kind of the geographic distribution of inflation. Any further comments on that?
Well, it's apparent that over the past 40 years or so, inflation has been substantially worse on the coast than in the interior of the country. So the Pacific coast and the Northeast in particular have been bad, and that's largely because of housing, which goes back to your point earlier. I mean, it's a nationwide problem, but it's especially bad in places like San Francisco and Boston and New York. Because those places, you talk about 7 in 10 doors, we have 0 doors. Well, also the zoning, but yeah. And this goes to a point that Roger has made many times about housing itself, which is that we have a system of laws which makes it very hard for the supply of housing to keep up with the demand from people. And that goes, there's a number of regulations that make that happen. One of them is that they make it basically illegal to do prefab housing, which would make things much more efficient. And instead in fact, construction is the only sector in the country that has seen a productivity decline since the 1960s. And so that, I think, is the biggest contributor to this. But
I don't have anything to add. I think, Jackson has done a lot of the great work for us on this regional variation of inflation. As you mentioned, Roger Valdez, one of our other scholars, has done a lot of work on zoning restrictions and permitting restrictions, which affect housing supply. And I would just say in general, I mentioned this in my opening remarks yesterday, that the kind of paradigm of the last 40 years of how the U.S. economy has evolved is we've juiced demand through subsidies. You subsidize something, then people can afford it more, and they'll buy more of it, right? That's an artificial subsidy of demand. And it's not just direct cash subsidies, sometimes lowering interest rates or subsidizing student loans. These are all ways in which demand gets subsidized. But then we restrict supply through these permitting restrictions, other regulatory barriers. So the paradigm of the last 45 years has been an increase in subsidies and an increase in restrictions on supply. And so demand goes up, supply gets constrained, and then we're surprised that prices have gone up. And that's a longer standing problem than the recent spate of inflation. That's obviously COVID restricted supply a lot. And so that was a challenge. But, one of the things that was really insightful about Jackson's first paper for us on inflation with Jonathan Hartley is that even low inflation over time is pretty corrosive. So again, there's been a lot of attention on this kind of big spike in inflation we've had the last couple of years. But what's, I think, another neglected aspect of inflation is that the period from, say, 1981 or 1982 to 2020, when inflation was 0 to 2% year after year after year, the conventional wisdom there among economists is that's been a victory, a policy victory. We've had very low inflation, isn't that great? But 2% inflation year after year over 20 years means that the real value of your money is, or the nominal value of your money, actually, the real value of your money is actually of your savings has been cut in half. That's just the power of compound interest, right? So if the value of what you save is declining by 2% in inflation terms, year after year after year, then the value of what you've saved has gone down. And that, again, particularly affects low-income people, because wealthy people who have savings that they're putting in the stock market and real estate, their wealth can accumulate. But if you don't have savings and you're living paycheck to paycheck, hopefully your wages are going up to track that inflation. But if they're not, then you're really struggling.
It's a great point that Avik makes. Katie's talking about constituents who are, living on rice and beans, or having a hard time paying rent, and the Fed has a 2% inflation target, right? So it's sort of saying, okay, well, notwithstanding, some of these, situations that individual consumers are facing, we're still going to sort of follow this 2% path, which kind of begs the question, and I'm interested in the panelists' views. When we think about the neglected drivers of inflation, is the Fed itself a driver of inflation, and should it have a more anti-inflationary set of policies?
So, I mean, the Fed itself acknowledges that it's a driver of inflation. I think that there are a number of justifications for the 2% target. One of them is that the Boston Commission found that they were probably, through a number of reasons, like, it's really hard to account for quality, or there's new goods. For example, when iPhones were introduced, they weren't part of CPI until maybe 2013 or so, and they'd been around for 6 years. And through these kinds of measures, they thought that, well, we're probably overestimating it by 0.5 to 1%. So a 2% target may be good, because in real terms, it's a 1% target. And then also, the other justification primarily has been that it's very hard to cut wages in nominal terms. So downward nominal wage rigidity. But if you have inflation, the downside of this is that people can't afford stuff, but sometimes wage cuts have to happen, but firms can't do it. And so in a way, it helps firms if we can have this kind of downward or some positive inflation. And during the pandemic, inflation, wages actually kept up much more for low-income people than high-income people, which is the flip side of that real wage coin, the value of my dollar. And that's largely because labor markets were more competitive for low-income people. But at the same time, just the fact that they were closer to the inflationary gap doesn't mean that it was better for them, because they're poor.
One thing I'd add is that the 2% target itself has changed significantly. So it used to be the Fed's target, again, over that 40-year period where everyone thought were patting themselves on the back about how well they'd managed inflation. 2% was a ceiling. So the Fed's goal was to keep inflation under 2%. Then, I guess just out of boredom, the Fed decided, we're kind of bored of this 0 to 2% inflation. We need to juice things a little more. We want to have a little more room. We're kind of bored by just kind of like keeping things under 2%. And so, in a memo that was certainly noticed by people who, again, are inflation geeks who follow stuff all the time, but maybe not by everybody else, in a wonky memo, the Federal Reserve said, we're going to change from a ceiling of 2% to an average of 2%. They called it FATE, Flexible Average Inflation Targeting. And the idea was that, what really matters is the average inflation rate is 2%. So if it goes to 3% or 1%, as long as the long-term average is 2%, we'll be good. But then, of course, they juiced the economy. Inflation went to 9% under the official measurement. Again, 18 if you trust Larry Summers. And so, okay, so 9% inflation. Did they then move inflation to negative 7% to kind of balance out the 9%? No, they didn't. Inflation is still above 2%. It's actually at 3% now. Everyone's like, oh, it's so great that it's at 3%. So if the flexible average inflation target is 2%, then inflation has to be basically negative for the next several years to get us back to a long-run average of 2%. And there's been zero discussion at the Fed of doing that. So the Fed's own stated doctrine is one they're not living by. And that's a big problem because, as any Fed economist will tell you, the most important thing the Fed has is its credibility. This is the big lesson from the inflation of the 70s that a lot of economists took away from the 70s, was that the perception of inflation is arguably more important than the reality of inflation. Meaning, if businesses believe that prices are going to go up by 10% and that they have to run their businesses accordingly, they're going to change their behavior in a way that actually will paradoxically drive more inflation, because they will demand higher prices from their customers and things like that to account for the possibility that prices will go up, blah, blah, blah. And it becomes this vicious spiral. And so if now the Fed's credibility has been undermined by the fact that inflation was high and they have no realistic way of meeting their stated goals of keeping it at 2%, that's a concern. Now, again, that concern has not been, I don't think there's been a loud chorus of people saying the Fed has no credibility. It's been more, again, inflation geeks who've been talking about this. But I do think it's a worry. I certainly don't see any, I don't know, and again, maybe Jackson has more thoughts on this, but I'm not observing from my seat any real concern from the Fed that, oh gosh, we've got to, we're undermining our own flexible average inflation target of 2%, and we got to do something about that.
So did they get rid of that?
Did they get rid of it? I don't know.
I thought they were going to get rid of. Well, effectively they got rid of it. In practice, I guess. Yeah. Anyway.
No, well, with regard to FATE, I think we all agree we need deflation of acronyms. The fewer acronyms, the better, because that's one thing we can agree on here. Katie, I want to come back to you. You mentioned housing policies before. You're in the world of policy in the legislature of Montana. What are other policies that are driving inflation apart from housing? Or on the flip side, what are some policies that you would recommend, that may help your constituents in terms of being able to deal with prices?
Yeah, so I would say, so to touch on housing policy a little bit better, in the 2023 session, which was the last time we convened, we did what Bloomberg called the Montana Miracle, and we completely reformed all of our zoning policy across the state. So this was very difficult. It wasn't easy by any means, but what we did was, and I'm glad that you mentioned zoning earlier, because what zoning effectively does, at least in my state, is it made it so the only things that are being constructed are either large houses that, cost around $400,000, which is, again, a lot where I'm from, or big high-rise apartments. So what we're really missing is, it's called the missing middle housing. So anybody that is kind of involved in housing policy will talk about that. So we made it legal to build a duplex anywhere there is single family zoning. We made it legal to build an ADU in your backyard, which is like a mother-in-law suite. And then we also passed a bill that is more of a reforming on our planning process. It makes all comments happen up front. So what a lot of times would happen is there's a new development, and then the community comes in and they decide to kill it. And then the developer has already invested so much time and money into that project that it's really a waste. I heard a statistic last year at a panel I was speaking on that 40% of the cost of housing is just regulatory. So that's your permitting, your, all of that stuff. So what we did in Montana is we looked at this from a root cause. So, like you mentioned with subsidies, that's what a lot of people, came to the legislature and they said, you need to subsidize housing, you need to subsidize housing. But that doesn't really actually solve the problem. It just slaps a Band-Aid on it that may or may not work. So our big housing policy reform, it's something that's going to take a long time to come into effect. It's not an overnight fix like a subsidy would be, but we're hoping that in 10 years from now, we're not worse off than we are now, because all of these policies have had time to, really take effect. So that is, I love talking about housing policy and all of the changes that we did. So that would be my big recommendation for policy changes.
The Montana Miracle, write that down. I love it. In Texas, we call the mother-in-law suites casitas. That's our term for it. Well, and what about other drivers of inflation? I mean, we're here in Washington, D.C. We've talked about the Fed. What about Congress? There's been obviously a big expansion of federal spending in the last several years. We had the CHIPS Act, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, put the name off to the side, large amounts of money flowing from Washington, D.C. into communities. Has that helped? Has that hurt? What's been the effect of that, of some of these major spending programs over the last few years?
Well, just to build on Katie's point, when you subsidize stuff, you get more demand, and if the supply isn't there to match up with it, then that's a problem. And that's what we did. During COVID, we had $6 trillion of stimulus to juice the economy because the economy had been shut down, and then we had $6 trillion of monetary stimulus from the Fed, and then you had an economy that was locked down. It's like that's how you got inflation. And yet I think just to one of the things that was interesting is Kamala Harris, went in her brief presidential campaign, she one of the things she tried to do when she finally got her policy team together and started putting some proposals out there, she was understanding that one of the big criticisms of the Biden-Harris administration was inflation, so she wanted to have a response to this. And she put out a bunch of bullet points on her website that were things like, okay, housing inflation is high. Let's give everybody who's a first-time home buyer a $5,000 subsidy for their down payment. First of all, a $5,000 subsidy for down payment is like peanuts, when you consider the price of housing. But secondly, it goes to this larger point, which is the response, especially by Democrats, but often by Republicans as well, is if something is too expensive, let's respond by subsidizing it more, as opposed to why is the thing so expensive in the first place? And to give an example that's more of a kind of a Republican critique, let's talk about the price of higher education. Higher education prices keep going up 7% a year because we subsidize the student loans and make it really cheap and make it easy for people to borrow. The federal government took over the student loan industry because of, just to your question, Mike, it was a pay for, quote unquote, for Obamacare, because the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, scored it as saving money because of an accounting gimmick, because you get all the revenue up front and then they pay for the people paying the loans back. That happens later. So it would, in the 10-year budget window, it looked like a positive thing for a fiscal, which is, again, completely a gimmick because it's not taking into account the default rates. But here's the point: is that the colleges, if you say, hey, we're going to subsidize student loans, and if people default later, well, that's just on the taxpayers. The university still gets paid. So once a university knows, oh, hey, I can increase my prices by 10%, and it won't affect students being able to come to this university because they can still borrow the money thanks to the government. And if the student defaults later after they've graduated, I've already been paid, so I don't care as a university. That's basically what's driven higher education inflation. That is a congressionally driven thing. It's Congress that took over the student loans in 2010. It's Congress that created a lot of these programs to subsidize student loans. And if you ask the typical Republican, what's my big idea for how to not have a Bernie Sanders style free college approach to all this, it's, hey, let's have private actors be able to lend you money in exchange for carving out 10% of your future income, which is just another way to finance the student debt. It doesn't actually address the underlying cost of higher education. And so, you have to actually unwind all the subsidies and say, actually, we're going to be, this is work we've done in FREOPP. We have to hold people more accountable for the fact that if you go to a university and they're charging you $200,000 and you can't pay it back, that's a negative ROI for you, return on investment for that degree. Why should the taxpayers be on the hook for that? And this is leaving aside all the Biden bailouts of student loans, right? That's turbocharged the inflation on the higher ed side, because if universities know that they really don't have to care because the student loans will be forgiven, then they're going to raise prices even more. So Biden has made the problem far worse, and the cost of those programs is hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. So again, the subsidizing of the higher education without really holding the universities accountable for what they're charging, it's a huge problem. And that's, again, not to say that we shouldn't try to help lower income people afford a college education, but it needs to be more targeted to low income people, number one, as opposed to everybody. And number two, you have to hold universities accountable for their prices. And so our idea on this at FREOPP is you can use this database that we've now built of every degree program in the country, undergraduate, graduate, associate degrees, professional school, and say, okay, if your program has a negative ROI, then why should we be subsidizing the student loans for that program? And so we make it up to the university. Either you lower the price for the degree so that the ROI is positive, or invest in your graduates so they earn more money so that the ROI is positive, or both. But don't ask the taxpayers to subsidize a program where you're charging, say, as Columbia University does, $150,000 for a master's in film studies, where most of the graduates don't become Steven Spielberg. They work for $10 an hour as gaffs or whatever. And so that's the real problem.
We're going to open it up for questions in just a second, but just before we do that, I've got one more for Katie. We haven't talked about energy, mining. Just give us your take on some of those issues. Are they also driving inflation from your perspective?
Yeah, so energy is a really interesting topic, and I think that that can it can definitely contribute to inflation. In Montana, we're actually about to run into an issue where we're going to have too much energy because we are a net exporter state. So we sell our energy to, Washington, Oregon, and we have a lot of coal-fired energy. And those states now have passed laws that they have to be, carbon-free by a certain year. And so we will have excess energy that now, we need to find something to do with that energy. When you add in, regulated monopolies for utilities, that they have an incentive to build, I think if I could wrap up what you just said in one small sentence, it would be, incentives are powerful. So when you have utilities that they are incentivized to just build more plants because then they get that positive asset, it just paints a really interesting picture. And again, I'm speaking from the perspective of my state. However, if you look at crypto mining or other large energy users, that's one way that, at least in Montana, we can capitalize on our excess energy. And in the case of crypto, if you have a server farm, then you are essentially digitally exporting your energy. So I also chair the Energy, Technology, and Federal Relations Committee in Montana. So I don't know, that might have been a little aside, but yeah.
Wonderful. Well, why don't we open it up? We got about 10 minutes to go. Why don't we open it up for questions? Should we pass the mic? Okay. Great.
Thank you. Utah will take your energy, first and foremost. My district has actually had 2 major data projects fall through recently because we can't get enough power. And PacifiCorp can't put in the infrastructure for that power without ridiculously raising rates on the rest of consumers, and the state's not subsidizing, and it's a whole disaster. So anyway, we'll change some regulatory things, and then you and I can talk, and we'll make some power happen. But my question was actually surrounding housing regulations. And Avik, you mentioned that zoning is a huge portion of that. So in my district, I represent one of the fastest growing areas in the country, down in Western Utah County. And one of my cities alone has 28,000 entitled units. These are units where a builder can go pull a permit and start digging tomorrow. But they're not. And even though all of those regulatory hoops have already been gone through, the builders just aren't building. So my question is, in your experience, what are other factors that play into that? And what can we do to get them to build? Like, setting aside regulations does nothing at that point because they've already met those hoops. Utah. So I'm from Utah.
Western Utah. What's the major city or the major town?
So Eagle Mountain.
Okay,
Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs. Between Saratoga the two, Springs, they have nearly 50,000 entitled units.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to the specifics because I don't know them. Yeah. But what I can tell you is that permitting and zoning are big factors. 2 other factors that may be playing a role. One is just the rise of interest rates means that when people lived with a 0% interest rate environment for so long, so they could borrow money at attractive rates to build housing, because that's typically what you're doing in these cases. You're borrowing the cash to then build the houses, and then you sell them, and then you pay back the loan that way. So if interest rates are higher, that just makes that whole process of financing, the cost of capital is higher. So the economics of building can be more costly. Now, I would argue that a 5% interest environment, historically, that's considered normal interest rates, and we should actually get used to 5% interest rates as actually a baseline. But because people have gotten spoiled with much lower interest rates for so long, I think that's one aspect of this that may be affecting things. Another factor that may be affecting what's going on in Western Utah is the supply of construction workers. So the financial crisis, when the financial crisis happened, there was a housing crash, as you remember, and then a lot of housing construction workers basically were out of work. And many of them, when things started to recover, didn't come back to the workforce. Some of them, it's because they got older and they retired. Some of them, they just found other careers and just left construction. And so we have a lower number of construction workers around the country. And then you factor in some of the things we talked about yesterday in terms of the fact that our welfare system for the bottom quintile of earners pays them more on an after-tax basis than if you're in the second lower quintile in terms of earnings. So a lot of people who are working in construction, even those are well-paying jobs, we've created a lot of incentives that have made labor scarce. So on top of just the micro factors that are specific to construction workers, there's a macro effect of the fact that we've made the labor market more scarce.
My name is Kathleen Chandler, and I'm with the Independence Institute in Denver. So we've got that Western vibe going on here, which is great. I would say that another incident of pressure for inflation would have to be what's going on specifically in Colorado. They passed a law last year that all eggs in the state have to be free range. So our egg prices went from $1 a dozen to over $4 and $5 a dozen. Because if you're Walmart, you have to comply with free range chicken eggs in the entire state. So it is not just, that's inflation, right? Off the bat, when you're paying that much money for eggs. So how can we that live in these captive states come up with policy that helps alleviate that kind of madness when the single mom is now paying $4 a dozen for eggs? I know, I wish. But do you see, because that's maybe not even taken into effect into your inflation thing because it's so specific to Colorado.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think it would be taken into account. But although, yeah, I don't know, elect better people. But I think there's maybe one distinction that should be made here, though, which is that a lot of the laws we've talked about, and that one in particular, aren't really inflation in the way that we mean it, because it's like inflation is we have continuous price increases. It's about the growth rate of prices. This would be like we increase prices one time, and so it wouldn't really be thought of as inflation anyway. And it actually goes to a lot of people have called Trump's tariff policies inflationary. They're bad, but they're not inflationary. It's just like the prices should go up once, basically, I guess. Thank you. Do you want to talk about
But in prices, you're right, it goes up once, but over time, it just adds to the complexity of it. And as a person who's paying that, I don't really care if it's inflation or if it's just a one-time price increase. It's there. And now you have the new ceiling or the new floor, so to speak, that your egg prices are going to be $4 a dozen. It's insanity.
maybe you need
I think you need a lawyer.
Oh,
we do. I was talking to my friend over here from Wyoming, Maggie, and if Cheyenne is just right inside the border of Wyoming, people do egg runs.
So anyway, taking it back to the East Coast housing, I was on the Planning and Zoning Commission for 25 years in Connecticut, so it's the East Coast, and there's 169 towns in Connecticut. They're all different, but certainly in this rural part of the state, the Northwest, we recognized the need for affordable housing. And so there were a lot of historic buildings, and we allowed accessory apartments to go in there changed the zoning in the center of town, and that's been for decades now. So it's good to hear that that's going on in Montana.
I'm glad
But
we could finally catch up.
Recently, I was in Montreal, and I was surprised because around a university that had an influx of foreign students coming because they opened up the borders in Canada to education in this university, not McGill, another one. The city enacted a policy to prevent developers from buying houses and using it for international students. So they insisted on owner occupied, which protected the Montrealers and allowed them to continue buying in the inner city. Now, I've followed zoning, but I had never heard of something quite like that. And when you think of so many of our East Coast and West Coast cities where there are universities, you know, all of that housing stock potentially is exclusionary for local residents because of the impact of housing students. So I'd like your comments about that.
Yeah, I can. One thing you're bringing up, which is it's not merely that subsidies drive inflation. They do, all else being equal. But the design of the subsidies can make a huge difference. So, for example, in housing, one of the things we've done historically is we'll say, okay, how should we subsidize housing? Let's build housing projects. Let's build new housing. And the problem is, just like with cars, new housing is always more expensive than old housing. Whereas if you design the subsidies where, like what's called Section 8, where you give people a subsidy to then shop for the housing that they want, a voucher you might even say, then people who are looking for housing, particularly low-income people, what are they going to do? They're going to shop for housing that's maybe a little bit older building that's going to be more affordable for that reason than a brand new building. And that allows the subsidy to be used in the most efficient way to basically buy the lowest cost housing. So a big part of, in what you're describing in the Montreal case, it's like a combo kind of problem. But basically, if you can actually, where we have subsidies and where we still want to have subsidies because we want people to have healthcare, we want people to have housing, if you design the subsidies in a way that reward, shoppers, then you can actually, and we do that with food stamps, right? SNAP is basically you get this cash kind of ATM card that you go to the grocery store for, but we don't build government grocery stores to then supply the food. Otherwise it'd be much more expensive. So, and what Canada's done is what happens in housing policy a lot of times is like Canada had this problem where they have a housing bubble. They blame these Chinese people who are coming in and buying a lot of real estate because you're not allowed to export money out of China. There are capital controls, but you can buy real estate. And so a lot of people bought real estate in Canada because the restrictions on buying real estate as a foreigner were lighter there. And then everyone in Canada got mad that housing got more expensive, and that's why there's this kind of international students, we're going to stop them from having the benefit here. So it's just politically sensitive in Canada and other places too.
This is somewhat of a comment, and Susan, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we first left after doing training in Boston. We left and moved to Connecticut, and we lived in a town called Litchfield, which is next to to Torrington, which was an old industrial town. Used to have a lot of factories, had a lot of housing, old housing. And in the 80s, there was and I don't know remember the details of this now, it's too many years ago, but there was a federal tax deduction for buying up these old houses and renovating them. And people were doing it. A lot of doctors, lawyers were buying these old houses and renovating it. I don't know if you remember, I don't know what the deduction was, but it was significant enough that this was very popular to do. And then the deduction was taken away and that all died, stopped. All the renovating of the housing. I'm just pointing out how the impact of the policy of that tax deduction, do you remember what it was for? You don't remember the details of it. Was quite significant. I mean, we now have the opposite incentive. We live in Cambridge, Mass. Now have the opposite incentive. Everything's being renovated because you take an old piece of something that doesn't look very nice, you wouldn't want to live in it, but you renovate it and you'll get $2.5 million for a 1,500 square foot apartment. And that's kind of like the going rate now. So everybody is renovating everything there because the pricing is so exorbitant.
That's a great comment. I think we're almost at time here. What an incredible panel and what an incredible conversation here. It's really impressive just to hear about all the different states and what's going on in Colorado and Connecticut and Utah and the Montana Miracle. I think kind of a through line through all of this is, a lot of these policies, they represent kind of affluent preferences, for the eggs and for, these kind of high end sort of experiences. And I think that's a nice way to sort of wrap us up, because what's really unique about FREOPP, and we're here with the founder of FREOPP, Avik, is it's an organization that is completely focused on the bottom half, and on helping the bottom half, advance their opportunities. So, we focused on, I think, a lot of the problems, but I think a lot of the solutions are right here in FREOPP. So I just encourage everyone here to continue thinking about FREOPP and contributing and participating in any way that you can, because, these policies really do make a difference. And I think a lot of what we need is really a change of focus on the impact of these policies, kind of across our society. So with that, thank you to my fellow panelists for the great conversation.